Welcome everyone to our next video interview. I'd like to welcome my next guest, Gert Sylvest. Gert, welcome to the class.
Thanks.
And Gert, can you tell us where you work?
Yeah, I'm a co-founder of a company that is called Tradeshift. It's a company that started in Copenhagen in 2010. And we are a cloud-based platform for collaboration between companies. So basically what we do is go to some of the largest companies in the world and onboard their supply chains, and then enable digital collaboration between all the parties, everything from source to pay and up to and including financial services. I've had various roles wearing the technical cap, so as a CTO, building engineering here, but also spent some years in China, also building our product and engineering there. And now heading up a new unit called Frontiers that has a special focus on blockchain, AI, and industrial IoT.
Excellent. And for our non-technical students, can you share with us your own personal definition of what is blockchain?
Sure, and maybe it needs to be a few concurrent explanations. So I think one way to look at blockchain is probably the classical definition of a distributed ledger. So it's basically a book where you write stuff that you want to keep as a permanent record. But I think one of the properties of blockchain is that you can do it in a way where all the participants in a particular transaction has to agree on the transaction before it can ever be written in a book. So if you compare it to the company books where each company keeps their own record, and then you have some auditor that goes in and verifies what goes in and what goes out. The distributed ledger has the property that you can get the parties together, agree on what is being exchanged, or the transaction, if you will, and only at that point in time will it be made public in the books.
So for example, if I owned a warehouse and I had your property in my warehouse, and I said, well, I'm holding 5 boxes of your property, I have to wait for you to say, yes, I agree, you do have 5 boxes of my property. Then it goes into the blockchain as verified data that, yes, there really are 5, because 2 people confirmed it.
Yeah, that's one good example. So that's how you see it used for cryptocurrencies. People have to agree on whether I transferred $1 to you, that it doesn't happen twice, and the order that we do those kind of transactions in. And blockchain as a technology ensures that every participant is in agreement on those facts.
So you talk a lot about the agreement part. So in your supply chain business, how are you actually using blockchain on a day-to-day basis for your business?
So I think there are a few good use cases, and where to start. Maybe let's start with the track and trace scenarios. So I think track and trace is one example where you basically, let's say from the consumer point of view, you want to ascertain that what you're buying is genuine, that it has authenticity, or that is up to the quality that you expect. From the side of the producer, you might be interested in knowing that your product actually reaches the destination audience, that it's not faked or counterfeited along the road. So it's an example of a serious event where many people together in the supply chain have to agree on where is the package, what's in the package, and in the end, during its lifetime. So track and trace is a good example where you can say the participants in the supply chain have to agree on, at the very least, the handover points, that you're seeing you're not losing things in the supply chain. You have to know something probably about the identities of the participants in the supply chain, and so on throughout. And today that's something that's very hard to realize. I think I saw a UK survey that said that 70% of all companies have zero insight into their supply chain or beyond the first hire. And I think a lot of this also has to do with that the participants in the supply chain don't necessarily agree on what happens or whether they are talking about the same thing. So I think you can use blockchain as one way to say, let's not write it in the books until we've all agreed that this actually happened.
So this seems to be kind of like a step-by-step open communication between both parties instead of the standard one-way communication of, yes, your 5 boxes have been shipped, and yes, they're now in Paris, and yes, they're coming to the US in 3 days. Instead, it's the other side saying, yes, I agree at that step. Yes, I agree they are there. Yes, I agree. Would that be an accurate statement? It's more of an open two-way communication?
Yeah, I think that's a fair way of saying it. And I think, the most prevalent use case when people talk about blockchain or distributed ledger, that is probably the cryptocurrency, so Bitcoin or Ethereum or one of these. And you can say they implement a kind of protocol, right? That I can transfer amount to you and you can transfer an amount to me, and things don't, new money don't appear or new tokens don't appear in the system or disappear unless under some kind of agreed protocol or process. And in a way you can say Bitcoin has defined this protocol. And what you do on the blockchain is basically it enforces the protocol so that all the participants in the network, or more than 50%, have to agree on, let's say, the order of transactions, and that it's a valid amount, that the account balances and things like that, until it can ever be registered. So you can imagine that you have this agreement around currencies, and you can make many other kinds of such agreements. For example, in the supply chain, in terms of track and trace, what is our handover point? What is the information we need to supply in order to agree on that? Do we need to agree on what is in the box, or do we just agree that I delivered a box to you with some stuff in it? So I think blockchain is very open to defining new sets of rules of these kinds.
So there's a huge increase in transparency and communication as far as its effect on the supply chain industry?
Exactly. I think transparency is really the key word here.
So let's walk through a little role playing. So imagine that you're one of the owners of Tradeshift, and you actually are, and I'm a customer. I'm your ideal customer. So can you share with me some specific products or services using blockchain in your company that could help me?
Yeah, sure. So maybe let me take a different example, which is supply chain financing. Mm-hmm. So today in global trade, you have an estimated of $9 trillion at any point of time that is outstanding between trade parties. So money being owed by buyers to suppliers. Okay. And it's also estimated that maybe 15% of this amount is covered by banks or traditional finance. So basically the temporary financing needs that suppliers have in this cycle. So if you read various World Bank studies, it's on the top 3 of challenges for small and medium-sized companies everywhere in the world to get access to finance. And one of the recurring ideas of how to make that possible is through trade receivables financing. But today, no banks or traditional financial institutions really understands how to estimate the risk of, let's say, the 99% companies in the world, which are the micro, small, and medium-sized companies.
So, for example, I'm a small company. I do consulting, and sometimes, usually people pay me right away, but sometimes they don't. The larger the company, the slower they are. Mm. So there's one company that, let's say they have an outstanding debt to me of $10,000, and I know they're not going to pay for what I call it net never. It's where it's supposed to be 30 days, but then it goes to 60, 90. But I need the money. I have to pay my rent, let's say. So I have a $10,000 debt from, let's say, a really good institution, someplace that's, I know they're going to pay, they're just super slow. So can you help me get paid sooner?
Exactly. So early payments on that. And let's say if you know about the relationships, the trade relationships here, right? So I might be a small seller, and as you say, you might be a large buyer with a known credit rating. We know I've sent you an invoice. Maybe it's a purchase order based invoice, and maybe it has been validated by the buyer. So if you can get this kind of transparency into the transactions going on, it becomes a no-brainer to actually provide credit to also the small companies in this relationship. And you mentioned transparency as one of the keywords for blockchain. So I think this is one of the key examples of that, actually, providing transparency into those kind of relationships and transactions, sharing them on a market of finances, and they could be banks, institutional finances, or peer-to-peer lending. You can suddenly provide access to finance to a whole new segment of companies that either has not had this access or where the access has been very expensive. And if you look at it from the perspective of the large buyer, we saw during the financial crisis that payment terms were just extended, as you say, almost never.
Yes.
Italy and Greece, we saw examples of 12 to 18 months.
Wow.
But it was a general trend. And what also many large companies experienced was that it disrupted their supply chain, because many of the smaller players that hadn't the strength to withstand this, they simply went out of business, or they delayed their deliveries because they couldn't afford investing in building up their stock or other things. So I think there's really an increased awareness also from large buyers that you need to keep good liquidity and health in your supply chain, and being able to offer financing is one of those examples.
So to finish up the first example, I'm owed, let's say, $10,000 for consulting services from Harvard University. They've been around 500 years. They always pay, a little bit slow perhaps. And I come to you and say, they always pay me. It's $10,000. We have a relationship. Harvard will sign a piece of paper that says to Tradeshift, yes, we owe Michael $10,000. We're going to be paying him in 30 days. If I give you all that information, will that give you enough faith and confidence to loan me my $10,000 sooner?
Yeah, so it might. So if I'm convinced of the authenticity of this paper, it came from Harvard, and maybe I have to be knowledgeable about Harvard. Maybe if I'm a European, I will say, I don't recognize this paper, or so on. So you need certain standards or protocols to ensure that this can happen efficiently. And this is actually where I believe blockchain comes in. It's not like blockchain magically solves everything for you. You need to have some agreement on the protocol, right? Like in the example of Bitcoin, you have to agree on what's a fundamental financial protocol for something like Bitcoin to work. But at least what you can get is some kind of agreement that types of companies like Harvard, what characterizes them? You said it yourself, more than 500 years, maybe at putting the bar really high, but it could be a certain revenue and a certain rating and this and that. And then you need to know about the relationship. Maybe you need to know the invoice. Maybe you need to know the relationship to the purchase order. But then you're pretty much set. And of course, if Harvard is in on that, let's say we use a blockchain and we agree on these facts and put them in there for nobody ever to change them again. I think that's very interesting to finances, because you have now two parties basically saying this happened.
And then, so let's say we get that agreement. Harvard has said everything that they need to say. I've given you all the information you need. Now it's on the blockchain, so it's in this distributed ledger, and your company can see it. And I assume some people that you've given permission to see it as well. With this now, what's the next step? Does this go out to people who like to bid for someone who's willing to loan me that money, and then I start that transaction? What happens next once we've made this step?
Yeah, so you can do various things. I think my pick would be to make a financial services marketplace and offer this information to a number of different financiers, because they each address different segments of companies and different regions and so on and so forth. So in this case, I would see blockchain as an enabler. And this is in fact what we are doing today. Also as a non-blockchain business, but I see blockchain as a further accelerator and enabler here.
So you're creating liquidity in the market that might not necessarily be there.
Exactly, and I think liquidity is maybe the other keyword around the blockchain, right? Because if you just look at the cryptocurrencies, you're talking about, democratizing access to transactions, right? I think Europe is relatively far ahead. If you look at the ability to open up the banking infrastructure, there is a new directive coming that basically requires that banks enable third parties to initiate money transfers within the banking system without necessarily them making a revenue on it. I think in other countries this is still a little bit further out, but I think this is one of the areas where blockchain came in very fast and say, here is programmable money. And I think the same is true in the supply chain financing scenario, that you suddenly have access to transactions that are programmable, that you can bring to a larger audience, that you can execute in real time and have control over and use for different use cases.
So let's say that, we have a repeat of 2008, and I always have a relationship with, let's say, Bank of America, where Bank of America has always seen that I get paid $10,000 2 months late all the time. They give me $9,500. When that $10,000 finally gets paid, they make the $500 profit. That's their finance charge. But then the market crashes. Now they say, we don't want to be in this business. Oh, we don't like it anymore. And now I'm stuck. I need cash. So now I could come to Tradeshift when the markets have crashed and traditional financing has closed up. And I could access all these different people, this entire network of someone who might be willing to give me 9,500 or 9,600 or 9,400. Would that be an accurate statement?
Exactly, and that's where the transparency comes in, because if you go to financing company this or that, they will apply their preset filter. So they will ask their standard 10 questions on your business and look at various pieces of evidence. But I think the greatest value probably you may have that lies within your relationships to your buyers, to your suppliers, and the actual histories of what happened in that relationship, right? So if you are a stable supplier to Harvard and you have a history of being paid, then that is very valuable information. And to me, blockchain is actually a technology that enables this kind of information to be captured in some sort of agreement and laid out transparently, and in a way that you kind of, this is a technology part, but that ensures that nobody comes in and alters that history because of, let's say, financial interests or,
And how about another kind of transaction? When I owned a food business, one of the good things is getting a big order. One of the bad things is getting a big order. So if I had a grocery store that wanted, this actually happened, it was a $50,000 order. So I had to go out and spend $25,000 on the ingredients, and then I had to spend more money on the labor, pay those people ahead of time, deliver it, and then hope they pay me, which usually they did, but there was always there's 30 days in between. And would I be able to say, hey, here's my purchase order for $50,000 from Whole Foods, super reputable place, they wire their payments within 10 days. Would you loan me money on that $50,000?
Exactly. I mean, that's why you would want to make a financing marketplace out of this, because if you look at the whole source to pay cycle, you could say, of course, you can finance something on the order alone. If you compare that to something where, let's say, there was a purchase order, there was an invoice, there were some goods delivered, but payment is still 30 days out. Yeah, the risk might be greater on financing on the order alone, but I see no reason why some players in the market would not want to do that and be able to do that with much lower risk than the banks, because basically the banks are not domain experts or market experts. So it's all about reducing risk through, the more verified information, the better. And think of blockchain as one of the enablers of capturing information that has been verified by multiple parties. Then you take the risk out of this little by little.
You give me an interesting idea. Tell me if this makes any sense. Imagine that I'm Deutsche Bank, and you're a baker, and I don't really know the food business. And when you need your $10,000 loan, I think, well, do I give them 9,800, 9,700? What do I do? Not really sure. But what if I was a different person? Let's say you're still the baker, but I'm a competitor, a bigger one. And I know that you're baking a different kind of bread, and I want to get in on that business, but I don't really want to bake brown bread. I bake white bread, let's say. And I see on the blockchain that you need some money, but I really know your business because I really know the bread business. You know what? I'm going to give you $9,800 because I know all these little mini details. So I'll give you your financing, but I'm not going to give you a great rate because I know no one else is going to loan you money because I really know what the risk is. And as long as you pay me, I'm fine with it. But I could actually diversify into taking profit out of the brown bread sector by financing you, and I'm actually your competitor. Would that work?
Yeah, I think that's up to the competitor to see what they get out of it. But sure, why not? And I think it's really up to the individual player, and that's also how we build the model to decide what is the information that they want to give up in this process. So, think of it like your iPhone or your Android. You buy an app, you install it, and then when you install it, it will ask you, can I access your GPS so I know where you are? Can I access your images? Can I access your email account? And these kind of questions. And that's essentially how we build our system, except you don't access pictures and videos, but you access all the transactions that are going on in the supply chain. So in this model, it's up to the user to decide, what is it I want to share? And I think from a financing perspective, that makes total sense because the more information I share, the more probably another party can lower their risk in terms of the financing, and that means I could get access to cheaper financing. But whether I want to share this amount of information or how broadly I want to share it, I think that's an individual decision that we as a company do not want to make on behalf of people. But getting back to the bakery scenario, of course, if people want to share this level of information, sure, why not? Might a competitor not go in and say, we actually want to finance it because of our domain inside?
Okay. And how do you make money with these transactions?
Well, so that's in establishing contact between the parties, and it's also in capturing some of this information. Because I think that's probably one of the things that people often overlook in the blockchain cases. I think you can dream up a million wonderful blockchain cases, but at the end of the day, everyone has to be able to answer, how are you going to capture this information? How are you going to digitize it? How are you going to get people to agree on the information and the protocol surrounding it? You can see in the case of Bitcoin, somebody just built Bitcoin and they decided that this is the protocol for the financial transactions. But every time you go into a new use case, if it's for supply chain, you have to ask yourself, how are we ever going to agree on, what is the information that participants need to submit? Because it needs to be, expressed in the same language, or people cannot anyway agree on what actually happened in the supply chain if one party speaks French and the other one speaks ancient Latin and so on. So I think that's a classical, table stakes problem that everyone needs to solve, and blockchain isn't magical. It doesn't do that for you. So I think our company plays a role in establishing that, and establishing the market for financing and making it usable. But blockchain is an enabler for some things.
And you take a transaction fee?
Yeah, in the case of financing, we will take a transaction fee.
And what other products or services do you have that use blockchain?
Yeah, so I mentioned Track. So basically capturing information of the various players in the supply chain, all the way from producer over logistics and warehouses and so on and so forth. So in this case, it's really, let's say, a method for stitching together the full chain of events of what happens between the blockchain. So that's one case. Yeah.
Like tracking a package.
Like, sorry, what?
Like tracking a package, like, where's my FedEx package along the route?
Yeah, and also how does it get repackaged along the road, right? I have some cigarettes, and now they're boxed, and now they're put into a shipping container, but it might be repackaged along the road. So this kind of full life cycle tracking.
Oh, okay. So I sent you a pallet of cigarettes. You go, yes. I say yes. It's going to be on the SS. Hope you make it to the other side. Shipping container. And I go, yes, I agree with that. And then you say, well, now you're going to be in shipping container B4. And
Yeah.
that would actually be new information. That's something that I wouldn't have known before. That, oh, now I actually know my shipping container. And I guess like follow the ship by GPS as it travels across the ocean, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so you could say that's maybe the tracing part of it, but where we are focusing right now, that's actually on tracking that information. So there are a number of industries where you as a producer, you're actually responsible for the whole life cycle of your product, so that it actually reaches the intended destination. So explosive and in the medical industry, those are some examples. So you're actually accountable also in the legal sense for knowing where your stuff ends up.
So if I had, like you say, medicine that was tainted and someone sues me, I would have the blockchain to say, no, actually it wasn't my medicine, or if it was, I could tell where it happened along the road where it was tainted, or prove that it wasn't tainted.
Exactly. That's some of the things you want to be able to do. That is exactly to see where did we lose track of things, or where could this have happened, and also to predict where, if a packet of cigarettes showed up in a country where it shouldn't be, which other packets of cigarette would I then expect to turn up in this country? So to be proactive about it.
I see. So within the blockchain arena in supply chain, who do you see being winners in the blockchain space, and who do you see being losers with blockchain coming into supply chain?
Maybe I don't know if I can be so clear, but I can definitely see some challenges that I think a lot of companies will run into, and a lot of the pilots that I've seen, because I think there are a number of quite impressive large scale pilots out there that are actually tracking things from cradle to grave. I think the challenge many of these projects will see will be actually breaking out of the pilot phase. And maybe it has a little bit less to do with blockchain than some of the other factors, like creating agreement on what are the data standards being used, what is the governance around this, and what's the extra value that blockchain gives us in this case. Why didn't we just implement it on traditional hardware? And to mention one thing is that I've seen several of these cases implemented as a closed loop system, where only the few participants of this were actually part of the blockchain. So let's compare it a little bit to the financing example. If traditionally you have a high degree of let's say privacy between the parties to an invoicing transaction or an ordering transaction. But if you lift it out of this privacy and share it with potential financiers, you can gain a lot of value from this. I think exactly the same is true in the track and trace scenario. If you can lift some of these transactions out of the confidentiality between two specific parties, you can gain a lot of value. And I think this is not something that blockchain in itself enables. It's something you have to incentivize people to share information. And a lot of the cases I see, they're really born inside of, let's call them supply chain silos. So their question will be, how do I lift it out of this pilot environment and bring it to global supply chains and prove that there's a value proposition to the participants? And fundamentally, I think if you don't bring the data to use in other scenarios, for example, in financing, which is a great case for with track and trace, then how am I ever going to incentivize people to adopt this technology and change their processes and invest in integrations and all of that kind of well-known territory?
So talking about change, imagine that it's 20 years into the future and everything has worked great with blockchain. Everything you were hoping would work did work, and it's just the perfect utopia. 20 years into the future, how's the world going to look differently in the supply chain arena? What are some really tangible things I'm going to be noticing that how's the industry changed in 20 years?
Oh, that's difficult. So if you look 20 years ahead, I think I would almost say, I don't care if we call it blockchain or what we will call it in 20 years. Maybe we'll call it Goog. I don't know, but I think there's a drive towards changing the fundamental systems of distribution of money and value in society. So, one of the things I think people will realize in a year from now that is just the level of investment that large banks, governments, and so on are doing in blockchain to try out cases around interbank settlement, large money transfers, direct audit of the transactions between companies, VAT recovery, digital currencies, and so on. So I think there's a trend which is about maybe limiting the role of banks in the way you distribute money in society.
Gotcha.
And if that happens, so what is the impact of supply chains on this? I think it fundamentally changes maybe the leverage that you can have as large companies in the world, because if you have easier access to finance as small and medium-sized companies, if you have easier access to market, if you can build your reputation on the blockchain and use that reputation to give you access to market, to give you access to finance, well, I think it will change actually the fundamental nature of blockchains and move the focus much more to what is the information moved in the blockchain rather than, in the supply chain, than rather necessarily what are the goods that are moved inside of the supply chain.
I could see startups being able to compete with larger, more established companies if they have faster access to financing.
Absolutely. And I guess you can that's one way of looking at Silicon Valley and the total investment going in there as investments in disrupting business models of established players.
Well, I could also see where global recessions and economic downturns could have been shortened. I know when I was in 2008, I was also in the real estate finance business, and it just all stopped. Even if you had a great deal, no longer doing that kind of business anymore. And I didn't know where to turn to other people. So some of that, a lot of really great deals didn't happen. And it would have been nice to turn to somewhere else where someone would say, yeah, I still have an appetite for this kind of risk. So I could see the liquidity being a big thing. Now, with regard to our students, they're always looking for good advice. So we're going to ask you for some good advice. Let's say that we have some students who want to get into the blockchain industry. They're ready to pivot. They could move somewhere. They could change careers. If you had a blank slate and someone wanted to be successful in the blockchain industry, where would you suggest they pivot or position themselves to be in the right place at the right time? Where should they focus within blockchain?
Yeah, that's a good question. So maybe you could look at the industries that will be impacted, first and foremost by blockchain, where you will see a lot of transformation happening, and then obviously I think it's in the financial services industry, and I think it's across the board. I think it's no matter if you look at large banks, and they're it's all areas. It's from basic know your customer processes to I mentioned interbank netting and transactions, which is the very large scale things, into digital currencies. I know there are a number of very high profile alliances around the world today looking at not replacing national currencies, but launching their own as good as national currencies. We already talked a lot about the financing space. So of course, in alternative financing models, including peer-to-peer, but also institutional finance. So that's an obvious one. Another area maybe accounting. I saw a report recently that said it's way on the top list of occupations that are ripe for being automated or making obsolete in the next. I don't know what the time perspective was, but I think it's an obvious one. So we've talked a lot about digitizing transaction flows between companies, and we haven't seen a lot of that in the past 35 years, although people have attempted digitization. But I think it's happening now, and what that means for accounting and auditing in general. I think we're going to see a really big impact there. And I think all of the accounting companies also are very interested in understanding this area and be on the forefront of this.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm sure you hear a lot about blockchain on the street, people just talking about it. And I do here, certainly in Cambridge. And I just quietly nod my head and say, most of these people do not know what they're talking about. Mm-hmm. Are there some common misuses of blockchain, some misconceptions, misunderstandings that you'd like to clear people up on? Like, oh, blockchain can't give you a bath, it can't cut your hair. Are there some misconceptions about blockchain that people should correct right now?
Yeah, I think one of the common ones, I mean, that is what could you call the fairy dust effect, that applies on blockchain and you will get trust and transparency. And I think that's fundamentally untrue, right? I think it's about, you have to create the environment that where people are incentivized to submit their data, to share it, to achieve this kind of transparency. And you have to have the right business cases where you can say, oh, here blockchain is an enabler for this trust. So one example is, I think private or permission blockchains, there are a lot of great viable use cases for that. But I also see it applied where you say, okay, let's take process A and then just put it on a private blockchain because maybe people are afraid of sharing their data in a broader context and so on. Where you can say, the fundamental premise of what blockchain can give you kind of falls away in some of these scenarios. I would like to think of the world as a place where there will be 1,000 different blockchains, and there will be some federations around these blockchains. There will be some federations and governments where people agree on what is it we use them for, what is the kind of information we put up there, and what is the value we get out of it. I think that comes almost before the blockchains. And it seems like people are sometimes skipping that step and thinking they can just deploy the technology.
I like the fairy dust. Yeah, apply some blockchain and everything's going to be great.
Yeah.
Are there Achilles heels to blockchain? Are there some things it just doesn't do well? Some risks that it actually brings to the picture? There's some bad things about blockchain. We just hear it's great. Is there some anti-fairy dust we should know about?
Yeah, so I think everyone needs to realize that it is very early days of blockchain. And, someone talked about, I think it was Brian Bielendorf of Hyperledger, who talked about, we are in the Cambrian explosion of blockchain, right? So what happens next? Do we see the comet coming in and killing all life here? Or do we see a slow evolution, or what is going to happen next? I think we are in the early days, and I think some of the acknowledged challenges with blockchains are around privacy. So how do we deal with privacy? How do we deal with what's the right pattern for non-public blockchains? And that's really relevant in a lot of business-to-business scenarios, because you come from environments where you have very high requirements to privacy, and suddenly you want to do something else. So what are the right patterns to be applied? So that's something to look out for.
You bring up an interesting idea. If I didn't want my competitors to know that I was, let's say back to the financing model, that, let's say I'm trying to give the impression that my company's doing well, but if I go on a blockchain, even a private blockchain that has everyone in my industry on it, and they see that I'm looking to borrow money, that might not be the kind of impression I'm trying to give out there, that I'm announcing to my competitor. I might be having money trouble, and maybe I'm in negotiations with them trying to buy me, and they start lowballing me because they see I'm looking for financing, something like that.
Sure. I think that's a good example, because you could take two approaches, right? You could say, one is to say, maybe we don't need to know specifically what your company is, but maybe we need to know some attributes of your company, like, what do you have a credit rating, where are you based, what does your customer base look like, things like that. Maybe that's good enough to put out there. Or you could take a different approach, say, I can share the full amount of information, but I want to create this private blockchain where only myself and you get insight into this information. And I think some people are making this choice today, and they're going for the private blockchain. But now we've talked around different ways of deriving value from the information in the blockchain, like, can you realize some different financing models on top of the information? Well, that then also implies that you actually want to lift out the data in a broader context and bring more people to the table. So you kind of have to figure out what's the right way to do it, what's the right balance between privacy and the consistency of data, and all these boring things that people always have been doing, but you kind of need to do that. And that's to say, when you now look at these private or permission blockchains, don't just look to the technology, but we are right now trying to find out what are the right patterns to support some of these use cases.
Right. It is early days. I'm sure we're going to find out more about what was a good unforeseen circumstance and what was a nightmare. My final question to you: what's a great question that I just didn't ask during this interview that people should know before we sign off?
I'm not sure, but one thing I think people are commonly confused about is maybe the relationship between the cryptocurrencies and some of the other use cases of blockchain, like we talked about track and trace and financing and whatnot. But I think we covered it a little bit, right? We talked about what is Bitcoin. It's a kind of an agreement about how to make transfer of money and ensure balances. And I think maybe that's sometimes a little bit of the overlooked power of blockchain. That is, it's not just about the book, the ledger of writing these agreements, but I think it's actually to the fact that you can have these kind of contracts of agreement that are also transparent there in the blockchain. That, for example, allows you to express a currency on top of a blockchain just by stating the agreement. How does this currency work? What are the kinds of transactions you can do? Can money start appearing or disappearing, or what are the terms? That these agreements that are executable, that they also can live on the blockchain and share the same kind of transparency and agreement between parties.
You make a good point. I hear probably once or twice a day where people think that Bitcoin is blockchain. And I say, no, blockchain's the engine that makes Bitcoin work, and blockchain can do other things that have nothing to do with Bitcoin. Early days.
Yeah.
Well, Gert, thank you so much for your time and all your wisdom and insights. I'm sure the students really appreciate it. I hope you have a great rest of your day and New Year. And thank you again for the time you spent with us today.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. Take care, Gert.
Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye.